And
Oh yeah, I
this is
said
already
it's before,
was
yeah.
said.
I know, I was here, but
And again,
it
and
needs to
again.
be mentioned again. He's actually the living spirit of this conference.
Right.
Probably me and Hanoch mostly also.
Yeah, but he isn't here, so.
Okay, so thank you very much. I'm just gonna put this to make sure that we are on time. Okay, so in this presentation, I intend to discuss some of the earliest liturgical writings of Wicca, the religion of pagan witchcraft, that has been formed in Britain during the late 1940s, early 1950s, and I'll present some of the textual sources that influenced its propagators as they formulated early Wiccan key texts. And I'll also touch a bit upon the attitudes towards these liturgies amongst Wiccans and neo-pagans today. Bless you. So the contemporary revival of paganism in the Western world owes much of its existence to Gerald Gardner, a retired British civil servant who embarked upon a quest to revive what he described as the ancient religion of pagan witchcraft, or Wicca as it came to be known. And he did this during the late 1940s and early 50s. And in the years following Gardner's death, he died in 1964, Wicca has evolved into the most widely known and influential of the denominations that today comprise what we call contemporary paganism. And actually today we have academic estimates that says that in the United States there are around 1 million neo-pagans, and in the UK, according to the 2011 state census, there are 85,000 contemporary pagans, amongst them Wiccans and Druids and what have you. Other Western nations each have between a few thousands to a few tens of thousands in each country. By the way, in Israel, this phenomena is relatively negligible, probably around 200, 300 people at the most who are actually identifying as, either Wiccans, neo-pagan witches, etc. Probably what Mariana will talk about later is a slightly different movement that's actually much more popular here in Israel. So, the creators of Wicca have drawn upon sources ranging from the earliest religious documents of the classical world to the ceremonial magic of the Renaissance, and also to the works of recent or more recent poets and novelists. Texts such as the reference to the offerings of cakes and libations to the Queen of Heaven in the book of Jeremiah, and Aleister Crowley's 1904 book, the Book of the Law, were both therefore valid sources of inspiration for the figures who helped to shape Wicca during the late 40s and early 50s. So Gerald Gardner, the founder and propagator of Wicca, presented it to the British public during the 1950s and early 60s till his death, mostly via newspaper and television interviews, which if we actually would have time I would be able to show you some of these, as well as through his own publications, the book that he publicized, which are 2 novels and 2 non-fiction books. And I'm going to talk first about these actual publications before we move on to the actual liturgies. So the first book was something that he wrote, the first novel is a novel called A Goddess Arrives, and he worked on this during 1939. It was published in December that year. And the whole plot basically of this novel is based upon the premise that the cult of Aphrodite owes its origin to the appearance of a human female who deluded the Cypriots, the people of Cyprus, into taking her for a divinity. And she herself was a witch who possessed genuine powers of divination, and she was well versed in old and arcane knowledge, and worked her rituals in the nude. Gardner was clearly influenced here by 19th century theories regarding the prehistoric matriarchy, and also by the writings of Margaret Murray, the famed archaeologist and folklorist, who claimed that the women executed during the European witch trial period were in fact part of an old pagan religion that survived in secret underneath Christianity. That was what we call today the Murray thesis, which since the 1970s actually has been debunked, but at the time that Gardner was operating, it was still at the height of its fashion. So, yeah, forgot to show you one of my favorite paintings, which is going to the Sabbath from the late 19th century, that commemorates basically the Murrayite thesis, even though it was painted a few decades before that. So, in 1949, Gardner published another novel titled High Magic's Aid, which is, it was set in medieval times and combined ceremonial magic with witchcraft. High Magic's Aid is a fictional account of a pair of brothers attempting to reclaim their a lost birthright of land, title, and position with the aid of a male magician and a female witch. And the contents of this book dealt with a mixture of high ceremonial magic, especially taken from Samuel Liddell Mather's Victorian edition of the Reignarchy of Solomon. And also, this novel comprised of the beliefs and rites of the new witch religion that Gardner was soon to promote. According to Gardner, basically his intent in writing this novel in 1949 was to suggest to the English reading public that there was a time in which witches were respected members of the community. And we must remember here that until 1951, it was still illegal in England to declare yourself a witch, a public witch, and to practice witchcraft. Only in 1951 this law was repealed, and here in Israel, by the way, we still have that law as a legacy of the British Mandate. We have an anti-witchcraft law in this country, which I'm sure that most of you were not aware of.
There's also a biblical law.
Yeah, also the biblical law, of course, but yeah, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live, etc. Yeah, of course. So, basically, Gardner had to present this, his narrative was that he had to present these materials as a work of fiction. And basically, he was actually following in the footsteps of the famed occultist Dion Fortune, who during the 1920s and 30s wrote several novels that featured magically adept individuals, and she actually declared that these novels were meant for people to, you know, stumble across them and via these novels to actually take an interest in occultism and maybe later find a group to get initiated into. So, sorry, my throat is also not doing so well. Yeah, a few book covers of Dion Fortune's novels from the 20s and 30s. So during the early 50s, Gardner actually regularly used High Magic's Aid as a kind of an introductory guide into Wicca, and he used to hand this book, this novel, to prospective students in order to hint at what witches believed and did, because what they actually did was something that they were also only supposed to know after they were initiated into his witch religion. And he also wanted to test their reaction to the descriptions in this book about ritual nudity and flagellation. Historian Ronald Hutton notes that the witch religion portrayed by Gardner in High Magic's Aid was actually the one depicted in Margaret Mary's book, The God of the Witches, in virtually every detail, and including its dedication to a single male deity of fertility, and even the actual name of that deity is something that Gardner actually took from Margaret Mary. And Gardner and Mary were actually very chummy, yeah, they were on friendly terms, and both of them were actually also members of the English Folklore Society. And Mary afterwards, in the early 50s, even wrote the preface to Gardner's non-fiction book, which is titled Witchcraft Today. And this book, Witchcraft Today, was the first public exposition of the practices and beliefs of what Gardner claimed to be a pre-Christian European religion, witchcraft, which is a remnant of this Stone Age religion. And he actually identified himself in this book as an anthropologist, writing about some people he had met, but he also made it clear that he actually was initiated into their group and had taken their oaths of secrecy. In 1959, he published his second non-fiction book, The Meaning of Witchcraft, where he presented himself both as an archaeologist and an anthropologist who has a long and keen interest in the magical beliefs of people and the actions that result from these beliefs. And he furthermore expressed great interest in Margaret Mary's theories regarding witchcraft as the remnant of an ancient religion. And overall, this book tries to provide an historical background for contemporary witchcraft of the time of Gerald Gardner. Now, what's important to note here that it's clear, however, that the puzzles surrounding Gardner's relationship with witchcraft cannot be solved purely by an analysis of his publications alone. And the most important and enduring literary work towards which he contributed was in fact one that he never intended to be published. Yeah? And what I'm referring to is the collections of instructions and rituals which represented the sacred texts of his witchcraft religion, and to which he would eventually give the evocative name of the Book of Shadows. If anyone saw Charmed,
Yes.
yeah, that's where they got the name from. Yeah, exactly. So by late 1948, Gardner had completed most of what is regarded today as the earliest known version of a witch liturgy. And that was a manuscript dubbed by him as a Ye-Book of Ye Art Magical. Okay? It was supposed to be to sound, ancient Middle English on purpose, yeah, to give it like an air of legitimacy, basically. And Gardner worked on this manuscript as early as 1947, that we know of, and this was following several visits he made to the aging ceremonial magician called Aleister Crowley. He visited him prior to his death in May 1947, and Crowley initiated Gardner into his magical order, the Ordo Templi Orientis. And the idea was that basically after Crowley's death later that year, Gardner was actually supposed to be the head of the European section of that order, the Ordo Templi Orientis. But his initial enthusiasm at the prospect of reviving this European operation of the OTO soon faded. And basically, while he was undoubtedly interested in ceremonial magic, he never exhibited much interest in Crowley's particular doctrines, including what we call the Law of Thelema, which was the magical religion that Crowley actually founded in the early 20th century. And basically Gardner's chief concern was to obtain rituals rather than understanding and articulating the theoretical structure that accompanied them. Yeah, he was basically back then something of a magpie trying to get his hands on as many ceremonial magic rituals as he could. Now, following the publication of his novel, High Magic's Aid, in 1949, Gardner began to devote himself wholly to Wicca, and he never again behaved as a member of Crowley's order, let alone as its European head. And yet, while Gardner himself ceased to identify with Crowley's Ordo Templi Orientis, the latter's published materials did indeed influence the development of early Wiccan liturgy during the late 1940s and early 50s. And again, historian Ronald Hutton actually divides, he did some work on this, he divides this influence of Crowley on Gerald Gardner to three distinct phases. And the first of these phases had to do with this manuscript that I mentioned, the first liturgy called the Book of the Art Magical, and which basically, in this book, in this manuscript, works written, edited, or directly influenced by Crowley, they represent the single largest body of matter on which this manuscript drew on. And actually, 139 of the 250 pages of that manuscript are made of materials basically drawn in from Aleister Crowley's works. I'm going to skip a bit here. For instance, one of these is, for instance, the third degree initiation. In Wicca, there are basically, in initiatory based Wicca, we have like 3 levels of initiation. First you enter into the neophyte level, and then you go into the initiation for the first degree. Follows obviously the second degree and the third and last degree, in which basically you become a high priest or high priestess, and you can also hive off into another coven, basically found your own coven and practice witchcraft with your own students, basically. So we can see that in the third degree initiation ritual presented in Book of the Art Magical actually includes key phrases from Crowley's sex magic teachings, and this actually remained a central part of the ritual ever since. Now, scholars really debate whether Gardner actually gained access to the secret sex magic materials of the OTO's 9th degree, which was one of the highest degrees of that order, and apparently Gardner probably was initiated into one of the lower levels of the order, and he never actually got to the higher levels. And if anything, Henrik Bogdan, for instance, Professor Henrik Bogdan, a good colleague of mine, he states that if anything, it appears that Gardner's use of ritualized sex in the Wiccan third degree had a different purpose and had more to do with his attempt to recreate a fertility cult rather than performing an act of sexual magic in Crowley's sense of the world. And I wish I would have more time to actually say more about Crowley's attitudes towards sex magic, but we won't have time for this, sadly. And also, we can see, according to Ronald Hutton, for instance, that the vital importance of Crowley in the compilation of Gardner's grimoire, his working magical manuscript. It's therefore it's obvious both in the provision of actual texts and also in a more general influence, which is in breaking free from the Judeo-Christian framework that was still employed at the time by the majority of British ritual magicians in the early 20th century. and instead placing consecrated sexuality at the heart of ritual symbolism, and providing a precedent for a rapturous goddess represented by a human priestess, because the high priestess is supposed to be an actual representation of the witch's goddess. So the second stage of Crowley's influence over Gardner in early Wiccan liturgy consists of further quotations that Gardner made from a variety of texts by Crowley, and these appeared in what we call the book, what basically Gardner called the Book of Shadows, and scholars also refer to this as Text A, because he had several books of shadows over the years, and this was the first of them. And this Book of Shadows, was the manuscript, the document which replaced Yibok of Ye'art Magikal as a working grimoire around 1948, 1949. And as a prototype of this kind of text, Text A contains not only ritual materials to be read at the temple, but also extracts from many of the books that Gardner looked to for information and inspiration as he was developing the background religion for his the religion of pagan witchcraft. And this document is actually reflective of the time in which contemporary witchcraft was born, and therefore it should be viewed by scholars as a foundational text. Now, an example for Gardner's reliance on Crowley for his own Book of Shadows has been presented recently by Lisa Crandall, who showed how and I can show you this here, how one of Crowley's pieces titled Energized Enthusiasm, actually how Gardner utilized this piece of writing in his own Book of Shadows. And Gardner was obviously interested, as you can see here, he was interested in Crowley's take on genius, and supposedly this genius was basically genius was something that fed upon some sort of a secretion from the human body, and this secretion, according to Crowley, was actually analogous to semen, and therefore found only in few men and fewer women. And these women, according to Crowley, in his eyes, were obviously androgyne, because how could they possess this? So the third and final phase in Crowley's influence over Gardner occurred during the mid-50s, and actually this consisted of Gardner's progressive attempt to diminish and to deny the extent of his association and debt to Crowley. Because basically he was now the propagator of an independent and by then fully functioning religious tradition that, and he presented Wicca to the world as as a religion that has unbroken continuity with the ancient past, a religion that existed from patriarchal times. So Gardner needed to downplay his borrowing from 20th century sources. And actually another important factor for the reason for diminishing and eliminating the works of Aleister Crowley from early Wiccan liturgy was Doreen Valiente, Gardner's student and the high priestess during the early 1950s. And her contributions to Wiccan liturgy began soon after her initiation into Wicca. I want to read you a bit of something from her recollections years later. She says something really nice. As we were sitting there in his flat having tea, about 2 hours to go to the ritual, I said to Gerald that we'd better rehearse this ritual, hadn't we? And he said in his funny little way, well, I haven't got the ritual. You can write one. Yeah? I realized later, she says, that perhaps the cunning old devil had deliberately thrown me at the deep end to see what I could do. But at the time I was horrified. So I skated hastily around his library and found Alexander Carmichael's Carmina Gadelica. That's a book that was first published in 1900, which was a collection of old Celtic songs, ballads, and ritual prayers, things like that, sort of half pagan, half Christian, which Alexander Carmichael had collected from the Celtic people of the Highlands during the 19th century. And so she goes on to say, and I thought, now this could be a good source to find something. And I found what seemed to be a suitable prayer. We can see here Carmichael's original wording, yeah? And I adapted it. That's what she said. And actually, a few years later, she also revised it further into the edition that was eventually published in Gerald Gardner's Witchcraft Today a non-fiction book that was published in 1954. So this is very interesting that we can see today, as historians, how religion sometimes, how the liturgy takes, how does it shape, and that's something that we can now do with religions that are, based thousands of years back into the past. Now, following her initiation, Valiente was given Gerald Gardner's own Book of Shadows to copy. That's something that every student in Wicca, after his initiation or her initiation, they receive the Book of Shadows of their high priest to copy it and afterwards add their own. Now, being well versed in occult literature, Valiente immediately noticed that this work was not actually had its origin in the ancient past, but actually on, very modern material. And first and foremost, the influence of Crowley could not be missed from her eyes. And Valiente confronted Gardner about this, and he initially brushed her remarks aside. But as the time passed and Gardner and Valiente became in practice Gardner's high priestess, he explained to her that the rituals he supposedly received from the witches that initiated him were very fragmentary, and that in order to make them workable, he felt compelled to supplement them with Crowley's work. And he felt that he was entitled to do this because he held a charter from Crowley to operate an OTO lodge, Crowley's occult order. Now, Crowley's posthumous notoriety basically discouraged Valiente from continuing Wicca's reliance on the old mages. And after Gardner's book, Witchcraft Today, was published and numerous letters began to arrive from people seeking initiation, Valiente's feelings on this matter even hardened, and she felt she finally managed to convince Gardner to give her free rein in rewriting the rituals and cutting away as much of the Crowleyanity as possible. And this is most evident in a part of the Book of Shadows known as the Charge of the Goddess. Now, in rituals in Wicca, the goddess is invoked into the body of the high priestess, and there is some like a charge that could be either read said silently or spontaneously, but there is also like fixed words in the Book of Shadows that the high priestess can use. And Gardner's original version of this charge was composed of sections taken almost word for word from the American folklorist Charles Godfrey Leland and his book Arabia, the Gospel of the Witches. And according to what Leland claimed back then, he was actually given these rituals by an Italian hereditary witch that he met in Tuscany. Rather dubious claim, but that's what he said. So Gardner also used the following lines that you can see here. This is what he took from Leland, and this is what he took from, again, almost word for word, from Aleister Crowley, a piece called The Law of Liberty. Now, Valiente, she was an admirer of Crowley's poetic abilities, but she maintained that Crowley's notoriety made this material, however beautiful, unsuitable for Wicca. Oh, I see that we have to, maybe I'm taking one more minute and that's it. So basically what she did was she rewrote the charge and incorporated most of the Leland material. You can see part of it, because I couldn't show you all of this on one slide here. But that's the main part of the charge that Lorraine Valiente wrote. And so she kept most of the Leland materials, just kept like 1 or 2 lines from Crowley, and added a lot of the materials of her own to what has become since then a most loved and piece of ritual writing by present-day witches throughout the world. And actually, during the 1970s and 80s, newcomers to Wicca would assume that this text was actually, you know, very traditional from the Middle Ages. I remember that I interviewed in my dissertation one of my interviewees. We talked about some New Age festivals in the UK that she went to, and she had stalls there in which she sold goddess figurines and everything. So she remembered that one of these times in Brighton, she was there was some woman visiting her stall wearing a long green cloak, and she seemed particularly interested in her posters, which had the charge of the goddess printed on them. And I remember from the interview, this woman, Shan Morgaine, said to me that other woman, and she said, oh, that's very interesting, you have the charge of the goddess. And Shan, said, yes, you see, it's the nearest thing that we witches have for a creed, and it's about this and this and this. And that woman waited very politely till she got to the end, and she said, yes, dear, I know, I wrote it. And that woman, of course, was Doreen Valiente herself. Okay, I actually think that, yeah, so maybe I'm going to say something a bit more. So what's interesting about the text A and the Book of Shadows, basically, and I'm going to finish with that, is that some scholars view it as a sort of an open canon, in which basically it's like an informative text, a text that is read, transmitted, but not followed to the letter, yeah, in the same sense practiced in Abrahamic faith, for example. And as the religion of Wicca actually changes, the Book of Shadows changes as well, and some parts are added to it, some are taken out of it to suit, you know, the modern needs of the present-day witches. And I actually wanted to say more of that, but maybe afterwards, because I don't want to steal more of Mariana's time. So.